ISIL says it's behind Friday's attacks in Tunisia and Kuwait, drawing yet more condemnation of the armed group's violent ideology. But what can be done to counter this complex combination of religion, conflict and extremism? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Tourists gunned down as they relaxed on a beach in Tunisia and worshippers murdered in a mosque in Kuwait. Both of Friday's atrocities have been claimed by ISIL, whose fighters are intent on carving out a caliphate straddling the border of Syria and Iraq and even beyond. The attacks have drawn more promises from the international community to fight what's referred to as the scourge of terrorism. Now, ISIL had earlier called on followers to turn the month of Ramadan, considered holy by Muslims, into, and I quote, calamities for non-believers. But is religion really at the heart of the armed group's ideology? Or is this fight more about politics and power? And how will this shape the fight against ISIL's message, its violence and its broader ambitions? So we've got lots and lots of questions on some rather complicated and sensitive issues. So let's introduce then our panel. Here in Doha, I'm joined by Professor Abdallah Baboud, Director of the Gulf Studies Centre at Qatar University. In Beirut, we have Jacob Sheikh, an investigative reporter for Politiken. And completing our lineup in Norwich, in the east of England, is Abdassamad Clark. He's Dean of the Muslim Faculty of Advanced Studies and Imam of the Ihsan Mosque. Welcome to you all. So as I say, this is a very timely debate, I think, that we can have and use this as an opportunity to explore some of the ideas that are floating around at the moment. First of all, can I start with you here in Doha, Professor Baboud, with defining, if you can, the exact moment that you find that we're in at the moment. We've just had a spate of violent attacks, a spotlight once again on the activities of ISIL, or at least groups affiliated to them.
Well, we are in a very dangerous moment, as you've just described. ISIL has spread its wings across Syria and Iraq, and it's now threatening the Gulf states. And it's now claiming terrorist attacks in Tunisia and other places. This beast, as it were, came out of nowhere. No one had really expected them to come. We were dealing with Al-Qaeda as a terror group, and now we have ISIL, which is even worse than Al-Qaeda, and more dangerous in the sense that now they control land and they have people under their mercy, and they control resources, which Al-Qaeda did not even have that kind of facilities. So we are going through a very uncharted terrain, as it were, because of ISIL and because of the act that they have done and the fact that they are now controlling countries and claiming the caliphate, as you've earlier mentioned.
And can I come to you, Abdassamad, in Norwich, and ask you to reflect upon the fact that ISIL and other extremist groups that use violence are often perpetrating these acts in the name of Islam. They're muddying the waters between whatever their aims are and religion.
Frankly, I think that fools nobody, and well-informed Muslims and non-Muslims know that this doesn't really represent the Deen of Islam. So I think this is a non-starter as an issue, although it is a very potent factor in their ideology.
But the problem is, for many people, of course, many people who perhaps are non-believers actually accuse Muslims more generally of being in support of what they consider to be a violent religion. So this is an issue that has to be confronted, isn't it?
It is confronted daily. The record of the Muslims and their conduct around the world is very clear. The Muslims are almost a quarter of humanity, and when people go among them, they don't meet a violent religion. So this is a very localized and particular phenomenon, And in fact, it's very indicative of modernity more than Islam, but that is a very far-reaching subject which we couldn't possibly deal with at the moment.
No, these are really big issues, aren't they, that we're talking about? But Professor Babu, can I come back to you and just say, well, we are in a moment of particular conflict, aren't we? Within the last 5 years, since 2010 pretty much, the world has been gripped by a number of conflicts and making this a much more violent period of time than, say, the preceding 10 years.
Absolutely. We are going through a very dangerous era at the moment because of the instability that has been caused because of the Arab Spring, the weak states that we have in the region, the conflict within states and between states in the region. So this conflict had provided a vacuum for these non-state actors to operate and find a way to galvanize support and material. And therefore, they're not only attacking and creating havoc, but also creating their own state with their nationality, with their army. And this is the first time in history, and at least in the modern history, that we see a non-violent group claiming its own state and capturing and occupying a very important land, pieces of land larger than some of the countries in the region. And we have all the international coalition against them, trying to fight them, and still have not been able to defeat them. So I think this is a very interesting, but dangerous moment that we are going through.
And can I come to you, Jacob, in Beirut, because, of course, you're an investigative journalist and you've profiled many of the young people, it's got to be said, they are young men for the most part, who want to go off and fight, who want to go off and get involved in violent acts in the name of Islam. Who are they? Briefly, if you can, who are they, particularly those who come from the West?
Well, as you said, it's a quite complex issue, but to be brief, they are, well, not necessarily economically marginalized, raised at the bottom of society, as many might think. They are usually middle-class kids. They are usually born and raised in Muslims, but not in Muslim families, but not very practicing Muslim families. So they are also, you could say, converts in some way or the other, meaning that they, within a short period of time, have been, adopting very harsh views, a very radical Islamist way of thinking. But also they are usually, at least that's what my investigation found, they're usually very socially marginalized some point up to the point where they decide to leave for Syria, for instance.
Right, so that's interesting because these are not necessarily those that you would automatically identify with extremism, those who are lacking in opportunity, lacking in education, but a common theme that seems to be arising is a lack of jobs. Your generation, Jacob, are perhaps more educated than those before. So you've had a decent education, you've had quite decent upbringings, as you say, quite affluent backgrounds, and yet the jobs, maybe the jobs are not there. Is it job creation that's at the root of this, would you say?
It could be jobs, but it could also be a lot of other things. I mean, these people are usually born and raised and shaped by say, democratic institutions, key institutions in Western democratic societies. But when I say they are usually, marginalized socially in some way or the other, I mean that they could have been facing troubles in their, social life. It could be experiencing a divorce, losing an elder brother. It could be losing your job. It could be dropping out of school because you can't keep up with the homework. These kind of things are usually seen before people decide to take the ultimate step and go to Syria.
Okay, so we're getting round to identifying the nature of the problem, at least to a small degree. Now, let's turn our attention to what possibly could be the policy response, because there's got to be a response to these acts of violence and the groups that are carrying them out. Can I come to you then, Abdasamed in Norwich, and from your experience, because you are working in the community in Norwich, in the east of England, how are Muslims reacting in your community to the atrocities that are being committed in their name, and indeed what, in your case, the British government is doing in response to that?
The community in Norwich is a particularly unusual one. We're not troubled with these things. Our young people are not tempted by these issues. And I think it goes back to something that Jakob said, basically that they're very often, these young people are people who don't know an awful lot about Islam. This is a theme that has come up recurrently. And we've made a point of studying and learning Islam well. Now, you mentioned policy initiatives and decisions, and Sheikh Abdul Haq Bewley, who's a very distinguished scholar and Imam of the Muslims in England, he's made the point very publicly that really there ought to be proper teaching about Islam within the educational nexus. And this, of course, is very difficult at the moment because education in Britain is very polarized and politicized at the moment. But really, in our situation, this is one of the most important things, that there's proper teaching of Islam within the educational nexus.
All right, Professor Babood, so there we're hearing that it's the teaching of Islam. So this is a problem then that Muslims have to grapple with in the first instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also, going back to your question as to what is policy response, I think different Muslims coming from different parts of the world have different motivations. And some of those motivations have been mentioned, the lack of jobs, the lack of opportunities, disenfranchisement within their own societies and marginalization. But also the whole idea of the Khilafat state, which is the utopian idea. When someone starts to learn Islam for the first time and they think about the glory days of Islam, this must be a very motivating point where they want to see this glory come back. They want to see the Khilafat with such a comprehensive legal system and economic and political system that they can aspire to. This doesn't exist. All the Muslim countries have been divided, as you know. They are all in conflict with each other. And for a Muslim from Europe looking, or from the United States or anywhere else outside the Muslim world, looking at the region thinking, wow, this is, we want to get the Khilafah back, and this is what ISIL is doing. People in the Middle East have a different motivation. I'm sure some of them have that, but the other motivation is the fact that the whole issue of the State of Israel, the whole issue of the conflict sectarian conflict between Shia and Sunnis, and of course what they see as some of their authoritarian governments and how they treated them. So basically, Islam to them has been hijacked by their own government, where there is an official Islam and there is nothing in between. So you have an official Islam, and the whole area is open for interpreters who can interpret Islam wrongly and have been interpreting it wrongly. And this is the bad people who are using the social media and the new technology to get the young people to...
Isn't it therefore incumbent upon the authorities of various Muslim countries, for instance, the Tunisians or the Kuwaitis, isn't it therefore incumbent upon them to make sure that the teaching is right, that the teaching of Islam is right? Clearly, you don't have jurisdiction or control over the internet, but in terms of making sure that young people are being taught the right version of Islam.
Absolutely right, and they should do so, and they should do more. But I think they should also allow Islam its space. It should not be controlled by the government. And it becomes just an official doctrine of the government. And you know what young people are like? They don't like anything to do with the government. If it's a government, if it's a media-controlled government, they like to see other media. If it's an Islam-controlled government, they want to see other Islam. And where is the other Islam? Who offers that? Is basically these radical groups who are... They find an easy prey on these young people, looking for new ideas and new ideology. And it's basically the fault of the governments in the region not to be able to provide the Islam that they need, and also not allowing the independent Islam scholars to be working on their own within the framework of Islam, but yet controlling them or driving them outside their own territories. And this is actually what happened in the past.
And Jacob in Beirut, I see you nodding your head. From your experience, what sort of advice would you give to the various policymakers around the world in terms of trying to counter what is becoming a wave of violence?
Well, first of all, if you need to counter a problem, you need to know what the problem is. And I mean, in order to sort of trying to counter this radical narrative, you need to look upon the appeal that ISIS has to youngsters in the West. As it was mentioned previously in this conversation, there's the geographical argument. You know, this group has actually been able to conquer land and establish a self-declared caliphate. They've been able to maintain and develop some kind of a welfare system that provides poor people with social needs and economical needs, at least to a certain extent. And also you have this utopia that was mentioned previously as well. I mean, this idea of this place where you can go immigrate and live purely according to the Islamic values. This is very attractive to young people. But then there's also another reason that we haven't discussed yet, and this is this very, very tight sense of belonging, this tight sense of brotherhood that ISIS and other radical Islamist groups are able to provide. Meaning that if people are vulnerable, socially marginalized, and looking for a place to stay, looking for a place to belong to, then ISIS is there with open arms, ready to provide you with that brotherhood.
Okay. So whilst we're talking about policymakers and possible responses, let's just have a look at the British Prime Minister David Cameron, who angered some Muslims last week by suggesting that there are those who, he says, quietly condone ISIL's ideology. He said there were members of the Muslim community who don't go as far as advocating violence, but who do buy into some of these prejudices. And he said, it paves the way for young people to turn simmering prejudice into murderous intent. Let's go back to you now, Abdasamed in Norwich, in the UK. How did your community react when you heard David Cameron suggesting that there were some among your ranks who were not as anti-ISIL and the ideology that they espouse as perhaps they should be?
Unfortunately, the Prime Minister's been rather off-key for quite some time. And actually, I'd like to pursue something that Jakob was saying there. Basically, that sense of brotherhood and engagement and involvement that the young people find. There are much, much wider issues than just this theme of radicalized young people. There are serious vacuums in our society which people are not looking at. We've got a society that's committed itself to finance and money and career in a way that leaves many, many people without any involvement. I don't mean jobs, I mean really sense of involvement in the society and belief in where it's going. And so this is, in one way, this is just a symptom of a deeper malaise. So
a kind of a spiritual disconnection, if you like, something like that. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, and these young people are a symptom. And in one way, one of the real issues in this matter is the destruction of the English language, because words like radical are now pejorative. And radical is a very good word. I'm not saying what these young people are doing is good, but radical means to try and go to the roots of things. Fundamentalism is to try and find the fundaments of what are the basic things, what are the important and basic issues. So now the language has got polarized for people who are ideologically motivated.
Indeed.
And this is not doing a service to anybody.
Absolutely. Very good point. And I know that Jacob would like to come in on that.
Right. I completely agree. But also, I think what strikes me when I speak with IS fighters or people that sympathize with them, and I've spoken to quite a few now, I see that these people are, youngsters that are, looking to find simple answers to very complex questions. And what strikes me when I speak to them is that they might as well have been, ended up in other societies, in other small communities, in gangs, in whatever community that would be able to provide them with brotherhood. So as it was mentioned, this is not just a question of religion, but really a social question that needs to be solved by giving these youngsters a possibility of belonging somewhere else than in the radical circles.
Absolutely. So, Professor Baboud, the malaise that's been described by both of our contributors there require a political response, don't they? And this is where the policymakers generally seem to be floundering somewhat.
Well, the policymakers don't really want to confront the problem because some of that is very uncomfortable for them. When you talk about the Middle East, you have authoritarian governments, you have malaise in the government themselves, you have dissatisfied population with the performance of the government in terms of the economic and social development, etc. And now you also add to that the failed states and the failing states and enter war between them. So it is not a very rosy picture to be able to confront that and say, this is the policy we have to make. There is a lot of mistrust between countries within the region, and therefore they cannot come with a general policy to counter this threat. What you see is going to be a piecemeal operation, unfortunately, whereby security will be heightened, which will also increase and be counterproductive, will increase the amount of dissatisfied and disenfranchised people. And the lack of accountable government also adds to this. There are no cooperation between themselves. There is no cooperation between them and the West because
this is very much a global problem. We're looking at a global issue, aren't we? So I think it was the Tunisian government actually within the last 2 days or so suggesting that there's got to be some sort of global answer which will require a huge amount of cooperation, wouldn't it?
It's easily said than done when it comes to cooperating on fighting this kind of phenomena. It's not easy, especially when you don't know the nature of the beast to begin with, and there is no agreement on what this beast is. How do you fight? You could start another war on terror as it happened, and we know what the results were. And this is basically, we are now living through the results of that. So I think what you need is a whole comprehensive solution that doesn't only tackle security, which is very important, but you need to tackle the root causes of why these young people are attracted to ISIL and its ideology. And some of the root causes is to do with education, with social cohesion, with providing jobs and employment, with providing political space for these young people to operate, and also for the development of the political and economic system in the Middle East. The state system that was instituted here after Westphalia is actually failing in many ways. And we need a new system whereby the state remains, but democracy and reform has to be built in.
Abdasamed in Norwich, if you could be brief, please. The word that is coming to my mind is inclusivity. It sounds as though that is the word that needs to be acted upon to bring people in to be part of a society, and following on from a point that you were making and about the disaffection of so many people.
Yes, inclusivity. But there's a real question as to whether the society we have is able to include anybody, whether it is a society. This is not in the sense of apportioning blame, but if we step back, and I was very pleased for the professor mentioning the Westphalian state and a longer perspective on the whole issue. There are much, much deeper things at stake here, and much wider issues. I know you asked me to be brief, I'm sorry about that, we're always engaged in the breaking news and the horrific things that come to us, but there are much deeper things that we need to reflect on seriously as a society, everybody, Muslims and non-Muslims, about our age, where it's come from and where we're going.
Well, can I thank you for that? It's impossible, isn't it, to be brief on such big, looming issues, but Abdasamed Clark talking to us from Norwich in England. Thank you very much indeed. Jacob Sheikh talking to us from Beirut. Thank you very much as well. And Professor Baboud here in Doha. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
And as ever, thank you for watching. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts. You can contact us on our programme page at aljazeera.com. You can also post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Or there's always a Twitter sphere at AJ Inside Story. From me, Martine Dennis, and the whole team, it's goodbye for now.